This week is Parshas Ki Sietzei. Ki Sietzei means when you shall go out. And this parsha is unique because it has more mitzvos than any other parsha in the Torah. Of the 613 mitzvos in the Torah, 74 of them are found in this week's parsha. So it's a rapid fire of mitzvos. And let's try to learn it and see what lessons we could derive. So the first mitzvah that it talks about is a very strange sounding mitzvah. You go out to war against your enemies and you'll be victorious. And then you're going to find a beautiful captive amongst the captives, and you're going to want to marry her. So we have Jewish soldiers going to war, and they see a beautiful woman who they are desirous of. What do they do then? So the Torah outlines what has to happen. They can take her. However, provided that there's certain requirements that are met. First of all, the Torah is obviously discouraging this. So you can bring her, but she shouldn't beautify herself. You should realize that this is probably a bad idea. And the Torah goes on to say that if you do marry such a woman, it's very likely that you will go on to hate her. But you can, if you want, you can convert her and she can join the Jewish people. Now, Rashi tells us, what's this idea that you go to war and you find a Gentile captive woman and you're suddenly allowed to marry her? Since when does the Torah start waiving prohibitions because of the conditions of war? So Rashi tells us, very famous Rashi, that the Torah, lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzer hara, the Torah did not speak in this instance only in opposition to counter the yetzer hara. Why? Because if the Almighty does not permit her, you'll marry her in sin. What the Torah is saying is like this. Someone goes out to war, very treacherous conditions that really change a person. And therefore, he is very susceptible to engaging in behavior that is unlike the behavior he would partake in otherwise. And therefore, the Torah says, if I do not allow this to go through, it'll happen in sin. And I think this is a good just mantra. It's a good motto. If you want to know what is Torah, what's the objective of Torah, how is Torah oriented to change a person? Here is perhaps a good answer. Lo dibra Torah ella keneged yetzer hara. The Torah is only coming to speak against the yetzer hara. We're placed in this world and we have headwinds. We face challenges. There's a yetzer hara, a force that is hell-bent on making us fail and making us lose what's special about us and making us sin. And the Torah is the tool for us overcoming this grave challenge. The Talmud tells us famously in the book of Kiddushin that the Almighty says to the Jewish people, I created a yetzer hara, I created a force that is oriented, that is designed, that is engineered to get you to sin. Barasi Torah Tavlin. I created the Torah as an antidote. And I think this also is illustrative of how we have to engage with our internal conflict. We have desires of prohibited things, and we're supposed to resist them. We have a yetzer hara, we're supposed to fight against it. Well, what do we see over here? A man goes to war, and he sees a beautiful captive, and he desires her, and the Torah says, capitulate, take her. And of course, the question is obvious. Shouldn't you resist the yetzer hara? Shouldn't you repel it? Why does the Torah allow this to happen? And of course, these are good questions. But there's a theme that my grandfather used to always bring about with regards to battling the yetzer hara by comparing it to a spring. We know when you push a spring, you feel a little kickback, a little pushback. But if you push it too hard, the pushback is going to be so excessive, it's going to send you flying in the opposite direction. When we want to resist our yetzer hara, when we want to overcome these grave challenges, we have to push it only a little bit. We have to resist only a little bit. If you push it too hard, if you try to resist it too much, then it's going to have the reverse effect. It's going to have the backlash, and you're going to suffer much more than the loss is going to be greater than what you're going to gain. There are some people, especially now during the month of Elul, people try to take their spiritual responsibility more seriously. And there are some people that like to do what's called a ta'anit dibur. Ta'anit means a fast, to withhold from food, but dibur means words. People would say to themselves, listen, words cause sin, and I don't want to sin. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop saying any words. I'm going to take a whole day off and be like a monk and be a day in silence. Some people do that, and there are the books of spirituality that encourage such behavior. But my grandfather used to always say, when someone does a ta'anit dibur, when someone says, I'm going to withhold from talking for a whole day, what actually happens in all likelihood is that when the day comes and the day's over, they have so much words and so much gossip bottled up within them that there's an explosion. So ironically, sometimes you push too hard, then the backlash and the totality, the aggregate, you're worse off. That's another lesson we see from here. The Torah obviously understands, in this case, with the conditions of war and the testosterone being so high, it's impossible for you to overcome this challenge, and therefore the Torah is going to carve out a loophole to make it permitted. Because if you try to overcome this, it may backfire. And I think there's another important lesson from this episode, from this mitzvah. Here the Torah tells us, you can't control it. But what does that imply? Only over here you can control it. Every other time you can. The Almighty only gives us challenges that we can withstand and we can overcome. If we cannot overcome it, if we cannot withstand it, then we will not be given it. And perhaps in this instance, with the beautiful captive in war, it's a case where we cannot overcome it, and therefore the Torah says, let's find a way to allow it. Maybe we can even connect this to the flood. The Almighty gave Houston as a city and all of us as individuals grave challenges. But obviously the Almighty believes in the resolve and the purpose and the unity and the camaraderie of our city and our people to gather together and rebuild, and we can and we will overcome. Another point, if you remember last week, who was part of the Jewish army? So remember last week, they talked about the fact that all the eligible men were gathered and they had a selection process. Who was going to be part of this army? And they weeded off anyone who had recently gotten engaged but wasn't married, anyone that had recently built a house but didn't live in it, and anyone that had planted a vineyard but did not harvest it. And additionally, anyone that has any sins. So you think about it. You have an army, and there's no sinners as soldiers in the army. All you have are righteous people. And what happens? The Torah says in the next parsha, you go out to war, and all you have is righteous soldiers. And what happens? One of them sees a beautiful captive, and he gets so lustfully desirous of her, and he says, I have to have her. Wait a minute, don't you have a family back home? What about your spiritual stature? The answer is that when someone goes out of the confines of their comfort zone, when someone goes to an area where they don't have the same guard up for things to protect themselves against things that could happen, no one knows where that could lead. My grandfather used to say he spent the war years, World War II, in Sweden. And he was a yeshiva student. He was a Torah scholar who went to Sweden, but he wasn't the only one that went to Sweden. He said there was many yeshiva students that would go to Sweden as a refuge because Sweden was neutral during World War II. And he said, almost to a man, yeshiva students that went to a place like this, that didn't value and denigrated Torah and Torah scholars, their spiritual stature tanked. And within a month, most of them had dropped everything. And now he himself would say about himself that the reason why he maintained his stature in such conditions is because he studied musar. He studied ethical refinement every day. But it's very easy, or it's not very easy, but at least it's manageable for someone to maintain their status when they're in a cocoon, when you're in a yeshiva, when you're in an environment that is conducive for such behavior. You go out to work, or you go to business meetings, or you go on a business trip, and you don't have your wife there, and you don't have your family there, and you don't have your community there, then you're very vulnerable. And we see these great people went to war, They went out, they're in the world, there's new conditions, there's new situations, and they're vulnerable. But we see the Torah does not despair. Even someone who has fallen what we would consider to be very grave depths, they're now consorting with an enemy captive, still the Torah legislates for such a person. We don't give up on anyone. You think perhaps we could say, oh, this person, well, they have bad character, or they have bad behavior, or they're a drug addict. These people, they're the drug addicts, so to speak. They're the people who are the dregs of society, and still the Torah says we don't give up on anyone. The Parsha continues by talking about a man who has two wives, one of them that he loves and one of them that he hates. And the halacha is, if a man gives, when a person dies, they bequeath their assets to their children. And the firstborn son, he takes double portion. So they divide the portion amongst the children, and the firstborn son gets a double portion. If the firstborn son is the son of the hated wife, then he still must receive the double portion. That's what the next section continues. Now Rashi explains the juxtaposition between these two episodes. The parsha starts off with a man who marries a woman, a Gentile woman, out of lust. And it says, the very next section, if you have a wife that you hate. Says Rashi, there's a deep connection between these two stories. When someone marries a woman out of lust, that union is probably not very strong, because the lust invariably dissipates. And lust alone will cause division. And the verse tells us in Proverbs, L'ta'ava yivakesh nifrad. When there's tava, when there's lust alone, invariably that will eventually weaken. And what do you have left? If the foundations of the relationship are lust alone, invariably, says the Torah, that you'll have a wife, achas ha'ova v'achas noah, you'll have one that you will hate. And the next section talks about, well, what happens when you have a wife that you hate? What does that do to the children? And the next section, beginning in verse 18, talks about when a man has a ben sorer umoreh, a wayward and rebellious son. This is a son who doesn't listen to his parents, who steals money from his parents and buys meat and wine, eats it in bad company. And the halacha is that such a person, on first offense, they have to be 13 years old and change. First offense, they get lashes. Second offense, they get executed. Now, the Talmud says that this actually never happened. Never happened, never will happen. So why is it written? It's written so that you should study it and gain reward. And the Talmud tells us that someone who steals money, well, yes, they're a criminal. And someone who eats wine in bad company, well, maybe that's not such great behavior. But does that really warrant that they should get executed? Of course not. So why do we kill the ben sorer umoreh, the wayward and rebellious son? Says the Talmud in Sanhedrin, Yamus zakai, let him die righteous, Ve'al yamus chayav, and let him not die wicked. The Torah is able to prognosticate. It's able to look into the future and say, someone who behaves like this now, invariably in the future, they will behave in a way that will guarantee that they will have be worthy of capital punishment. And therefore, it's better to kill him today when he's still innocent. He hasn't committed any grievous sins worthy of capital punishment than to wait for him to be killed and executed as a result of his sins. Now, obviously, the question is, if this never happened and never will happen, then why are we told about it? And the Talmud says, well, you study it and you gain reward. So what's this reward that you gain? So, of course, all the commentaries explain what this means, what the reward is. Simply put, it means, well, you study Torah, and there's a great reward for studying Torah. But perhaps on a deeper level, we could say as follows. The halacha is that a ben sorer umoreh only gets executed if his parents willfully take him to court. So if the parents opt out, they say, you know what? We don't want to have this case judged. We don't want him to bring him to court. If they opt to not bring him to court, then the case doesn't happen. And they have to bring him to court once to be flogged, a second time to be executed. And that's the reason why the Talmud says it never happened, never will happen, because no parent is going to bring their cherubic, innocent adolescent to court to be executed. But perhaps we could say that this is maybe the lesson. Perhaps a parent has to recognize that a child, their responsibility is that the child flourishes. And how do they flourish? More specifically, not just that they flourish in their physical sense, in their body, so to speak, in this world, but that they flourish in their soul, and they flourish for eternity, and they're here for a mission. And the worst thing that can happen to someone is, on a spiritual sense, is they live a life of sin. And they live a life where they behave in a way that erodes and corrodes their soul. And therefore, the lesson is that a parent should recognize, think about it, maybe even theoretically recognize that the Torah tells you, Yamus Zakai Va'al Yamus Chayev, it is preferable for your son to die innocently than to die old as a sinner. And there's been many times in history, for example, during the Crusades, it was quite common where the Jews would know that their children are going to be kidnapped by the Christians. Very young children not going to remember their Jewish identity, and they're going to be raised as Christians. And there's been many times documented in history where Jewish parents actually killed their own children to save them from the fate of living as an apostate, living as a Christian. And this is an example. Of course, it's a very tragic happenstance, but this is an example of this idea where a parent recognizes that their responsibility as a parent extends beyond the physical, earthly, ephemeral well-being of their child and extends to the spiritual, eternal life of the child. And therefore, it's more important that the child dies righteous, even if it means dying righteous young, than to live their life as a sinner. The next section talks about what happens when someone is executed in a court. And we know there's 4 methods of execution, and the worst of them, which is called stoning, it has within it another halacha that the body, after it's executed, it has to be hung. Talmud tells us that this is only for several minutes. They have to hang him before nightfall, right? Immediately before nightfall, and then right before nightfall, take him down, because you have to bury him right away. And it's interesting, the Talmud understands from this particular section the mitzvah of burying the dead quickly. What happens when someone dies and their children, well, they have a few things going on. So what happens typically in non-Jewish environments is that they wait till it's a more convenient time to have the funeral. Wait for the children, wait till for a Sunday, wait for all the other elements to be present. We're told in Jewish law that it's imperative that the person is buried as soon as possible, so long as the cadaver is not interred in the ground, the soul actually experiences excruciating pain and suffering. And the Talmud even describes how the soul is, so to speak, suspended between two worlds and doesn't begin the process of transitioning from this world to the next world until the body is covered. Which is why, for example, in Jerusalem, the custom is that as soon as the person dies, they bury him. Even if it means burying them in the middle of the night or late at night or in a way where the person will not have a very well-attended funeral. In my grandfather's case, because my grandfather was such a great rabbi and scholar who had a tremendous impact on many of the people of his generation, the halakhic authorities ruled that even though he died late at night around 10 p.m., they could delay the funeral until noon the following day, because that would be an honor for the deceased to have a much more well-attended funeral than it's allowed. The Talmud says if you're delaying a funeral for the benefit of the deceased, you're allowed to delay it. However, if it's just for your own convenience, then it would not be allowed. There's another story about verse 22, chapter 21, verse 22. The verse reads, literally, when a man has a sin, a judgment of death, and he is killed, and you should hang him on a tree. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, one of the great Kabbalists of yore in Tzfat, when he died, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, he used this verse to eulogize him. And he read it as follows. When a man has a chet mishpat mavetz, chet literally means a lacking. When someone is lacking a mishpat mavetz, there's no reason why they should die. They're lacking a judgment of death. They have not sinned, and there's no reason why they should die. V'humas, however, they die anyhow. V'talisa osa al ha'etz. You should explain their death by looking at the eitz, at the tree. Which means when Adam ate from the tree, the world is forever now going to suffer the fate of death. And most people die because of their own sins. But when someone dies and there is a dearth of sins, there's no way we can explain it. We have to explain it going back to the tree. Another important Rashi here. Rashi says that we have to take the person down because it's a shame to God the fact that there is a human being hung. And Rashi tells us a very famous example. You have two twins. One of them became a king, and the other one became a criminal. And the criminal was tried and was sentenced to death and was hung. When everyone sees him hanging, they say, oh no, the king was hung, because the person is an identical twin to the king. And that is a shame for the king. So too says Rashi, when a human sins and a human is executed, because man is created in the image of God, it's almost like man is a twin with the Almighty. Therefore, it's a shame to God to have him be hung, and therefore he has to be taken down as soon as possible. And I think that's a very powerful lesson, like to think about, wow, we are like twins with God. How much responsibility does it mean for us when we have this on our shoulders, the fact that we are a representation of God, and all the more so, not just as humanity, as a species, but as Jews, as we've seen several times throughout Deuteronomy, we are called the chosen people of God. When people look at us, they see us as a proxy of God. How much more so do we need to make sure that our behavior is worthy of such a classification? Chapter 22 begins with the laws of returning a lost object. There's many details, of course, as all Torah laws are, especially this laws found in this week's Parsha. But generally speaking, if you find a lost object, your duty is to find the original owner and return it to him. What if you can't find the owner? Then you have to be a worthy steward of that item. The Talmud, in the book of Tainus on page 25, tells us a remarkable story about the great Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. There's many stories told to us about him specifically. This one relates to returning lost objects. And the story goes that he found, his wife specifically found a basket of eggs on their front door. And of course, it was a lost object. So they brought it inside, and Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa told his wife, don't eat these eggs. So that eventually the eggs hatched and became into little chickens. And the chickens started to propagate, and he sold them, and he bought much bigger animals. He bought goats. And sometime later, the goats are growing, and there's a whole flock of them. And the person who lost the item, he's like, I left a bunch of eggs over here. Do you know where those eggs are? So he brings them out to the pasture and shows them a whole flock of goats. Here are your eggs. And he gave them all those goats. Of course, that shows the great character of our great sages. Now, in verse 2 here, it says that you should return a lost object to him. And the Talmud actually points out that if there is a requirement to return someone's physical item, someone loses their wallet, or they lose, their phone, you have to return it to them. Well, what if they lose their body or they lose their soul? The Talmud says if you see someone, and I think this is, of course, very pertinent to us today in Houston, if you see someone who's about to lose their life, it's actually a requirement to return, so to speak, their lost object, which is their life, to them. Their life is in flux. Will they live? Will they die? You got to return it to them. And of course, if it's a mitzvah to save someone's life, how much more so is it a mitzvah to save someone's spiritual life? And of course, we say that Torah is life, and thus by teaching Torah, by spreading Torah, by supporting Torah, we are returning, so to speak, the souls to their rightful owners. The verse continues, many, many laws here. We can't go through all of them at once. Not to cross-dress, that's one of the laws. And then there's the law of the Kan Sipor, the Shiluach HaKan. And just briefly, what it means is you're traveling and you happen to chance upon a nest that has eggs or has little chicklets, and you have to send away the mom before taking away the eggs. And the verse concludes, if you do this mitzvah, it'll be good for you and you'll have a long life. Says Rashi, this is a mitzvah after all. That's a free mitzvah, right? You go out to your field, or you happen to be walking along the path and you see a nest and it has eggs in it, you just send away the mom and take away the eggs, and it's yours to keep. And if a free mitzvah, a mitzvah doesn't cost anything, guarantees a reward of eternal life, how much more so does a mitzvah that's difficult to do, a mitzvah perhaps that's costly, how much more so can we be assured of being given a fair reward on orders of magnitude of greatness to the act that we contributed. The principle is lefum tsara agra. The degree of pain and difficulty we have in doing any mitzvah is proportional to the reward that we have for doing a mitzvah. If a mitzvah, two people could do the same mitzvah. For one of them it's easy, for one of them it's hard. The person who they're doing the exact same action, but the Almighty judges it in relative terms. For someone who was very difficult to do it, they get a great reward. Someone who was easy for, well, they get a reward, but not quite as great. Next law, someone builds a house. They have to build a fence around the roof so that no one will fall down. And if they fall down, of course, they are liable. So I think this does not apply only, of course, to homes, to swimming pools, to any kind of dangerous obstacle. You have to ensure that there is safety for those around it. They shouldn't, God forbid, fall in or hurt themselves. Now, there's an interesting philosophical dilemma surrounding this mitzvah. The mitzvahs were told to put a fence around their house and to not place blood in our homes. What this means is that if we don't put a fence around our roof and someone dies, well, we cause them to die. And the philosophical question is, wait a minute, doesn't God oversee everything? Doesn't God decide who dies and when they die? Why is it placed in our hands? Or what's kind of the philosophical understanding of how we're told here that we are the ones who are in charge to ensure that no one else dies? So there's a very important chinuch. The chinuch is a book written in the 12th or 13th century. Its origins, exact authorship is somewhat unknown. We know his name is Rabbi Aaron Halevi. Who it is exactly is a subject of dispute. But what he does is he delineates the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah in the order in which they appear in the Torah, and he gives a little synopsis of the laws of the mitzvah, to whom it applies, and additionally he talks about what the roots of the mitzvah are. What is the meaning, what's the lessons behind the mitzvah? And in this particular mitzvah, he addresses our question. You're told to put a fence around your roof, and if you don't put a fence around your roof, you may be causing people to die. Wait a minute. Doesn't the Almighty oversee everything, knows what's happening, and everything good and happen only happens because of what He wants? And he says something very powerful. He says the Almighty created the world and built it on the foundations of teva, of nature. And He ruled, He decreed that fire burns and water extinguishes fire. And he also ruled that if a huge stone falls on someone's head, God forbid, then their brain will be squashed. And if someone falls off a roof that's very tall, they'll die. So there's this balance here that the Almighty placed us in a world, and we're kind of subject to the rules of nature. And therefore, we have the mind and the mitzvah and the mandate to ensure that bad things don't happen as a result of our negligence. Therefore, we're told that we have to have a fence around the roof, or else we may cause someone to die. And I think this extends to other areas of living. The Almighty gives us everything. Well, so can I just lay down on my couch and wait for the Almighty to parachute all the goodness to me? Of course not. There's this balance. And we talk about prayer. Prayer really raises the same question. Someone's sick, so I want to pray for that they get better. I say, God, this person is good. Let him be better. Rifa'enu Hashem v'nei rafeh. Give us healing. Well, wait a minute. If the person is sick, who made him sick? It's God that made him sick. If the person's poor, well, who made them poor? It's God. So how can I try to interfere and say, you know what? You, God, you want him to be sick, but I want him to be better. And the answer is that who runs the world? Of course, the Almighty runs the world. But the Almighty gives us. We're created in the image of God. We also have a say in what happens. And therefore, with our prayer, we take a seat at the table. And we say, you know what? This person is either going to live or going to die. If we don't pray, he may die. If we do pray, we are declaring that we want him to live. And therefore, we indeed do have a say. A very powerful teaching from the Chinuch that shows us this balance that we have to strike. Of course, we have to recognize that everything's from God, but that we should not rest on our laurels and be complacent and not do what it is that we need to do to achieve what it is we want to achieve. And he continues by talking about the great tzaddikim, Abraham. If we are subject to nature, Abraham, he's a step up on the totem pole. Nature is subject to him. So Abraham's thrown into the fire. Well, what happens? The fire doesn't impact him at all. Even his hair is not singed. Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, they're thrown into the lion's den. Well, lions that are hungry eat people. But that's the rules of nature. A tzaddik can transcend and go above that and not be subject to the laws of nature at all. We talk about the Torah as being the blueprint for creation. Istakel ba'araisa ubara alma. The Almighty used the Torah to create the world. And therefore, the Torah, so to speak, governs the world. If someone is a master of Torah, by definition, they're a master of the world as well. If someone does not have Torah, well, then they're subject to the world. If someone does have Torah to this very high degree, then the world is subject to them. Next couple of laws here talk about kilayim, various forms of kilayim. We're not allowed to intermix different species to breed. We're not allowed to have different species pull a plow together. We're not allowed to take wool and linen and weave it together into one garment. We're not allowed to have two forms of grain to be planted next to each other. And then the next case talks about what happens when a man accuses his wife of being unfaithful. So there's many details of this law, but generally put that we have to have a court case to find out if the man's claims are legitimate or not. If he lied, then he gets flogged. They bring him to court and they punish him in a very severe way. They bring him basically an inch away from death. They take a massive rod and they cane him if he makes a false accusation of his wife's unfaithfulness. And additionally, he's penalized, and all the keys to determining what happens with this relationship is given to her. So a man, generally, a couple, they're allowed to get divorced if they want to, but that's a bilateral decision. Here, if a man accuses his wife of committing adultery, and he turns out to be a liar, that right that he has to have a say in the termination of the marriage is removed from him. So a lot of people like to look at this as being an example of some sort of barbarism. The Torah forces a man a woman to partake in a marriage against her will. That's the exact opposite. Here, the woman's given all the keys. If the man was not being honest in his claim of unfaithfulness, then she could decide if she wants a divorce, but he has to remain with her and he has to follow whatever she says. Now, what happens if there was a case of rape? We're told if a woman's raped, she is not held responsible, of course. People cannot held responsible for behavior that they could not have stopped. But additionally, in a case where the woman was unmarried, and we know historically, when a woman was defiled in such a way, she'll become damaged goods. And therefore, a woman has the option, if she wants, to marry the man who seduced her, and he cannot divorce her again because, if she chooses, of course, this is up to her decision to choose, but that is an example of giving her a leg up, so to speak, where he can no longer divorce her for the rest of his life, and she can choose if she wants, and she has all the power. The parsha continues talking about various people that are not allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. So, for example, a mamzer. Mamzer is someone who is a progeny of a prohibited relationship. They cannot marry amongst the Jewish people. People with various illnesses or injuries cannot marry amongst the Jewish people. And then it talks about the Ammonim and the Moavim. These are various nations that the Jewish people interacted with previously in the Torah. And we're told even if they convert and become Jewish, they're not allowed to intermarry amongst the Jewish people. And interestingly, the Torah in verse 5 of chapter 23 tells us the reason why these nations are not allowed to intermarry amongst the Jewish people. Al dvar asher lo kidmu eschem belechem u'b'mayim. When the Jewish people were vulnerable, when the Jewish people had grave needs, and they encountered this nation did not come out and greet them with bread and with water. To be a Jew, to be part of the Jewish nation, to be part of the Jewish destiny, to be a bearer of the Abrahamic legacy, you have to have good character. A nation that is so corrupted that they're not willing to show favor and to reach out to those in need, they're a nation that cannot be part of the Jewish people. If they did not come out and see the refugee nation, they're escaping Egypt, and they don't come out and give them bread and water, if they don't have kindness, that's the Jewish baseline. They can never join the Jewish nation. They can never intermarry amongst the people. However, the Egyptians, they are allowed to intermarry provided that they're 3 generations removed. So if you have an Egyptian family that converts, their grandchildren will be allowed to intermarry amongst the Jewish people. And Rashi points out that the Moabites, they were the ones who tried to engage in sin with the nation and cause their spiritual devolvement. So it's interesting. The Egyptians, we remember Exodus, these were the genocidal murderers who took Jewish babies and threw them into the water and killed them. So how is it possible that the nation that is so morally corrupt that they kill babies, infanticide, they're allowed to join the Jewish people, but the Moabites are not? So Rashi says, look at this. This shows that someone who has spiritual sins, they're worse than someone that has physical sins. The Jewish people were attacked by 2 nations. The Egyptians attacked them physically. The Moabites attacked them spiritually. Which one's worse? The Moabites. A spiritual loss is much worse than a physical. Spiritual violence is much deadlier than physical violence. Verse 10 here. When you go out to war against your enemies, you should guard from any bad thing. The ensuing verses show us the bad thing that it's referencing is sinful thoughts at night. And the Talmud, very famous teaching in the Talmud, that serves as the basis of the book, The Path of the Just, The Way of the Upright, Mesilas Yesharim of Ramchal. It's based upon a Talmudic teaching on this verse. What does it mean that you should not have, you should guard yourself from any evil? Don't think things during the day that will bring you to impurity during the night. You should avoid any sort of behavior by day that causes sin by night. And on that, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, the great Tana, the great rabbi of the Mishnayit era, he lays out the whole ladder of the book of Mesilas Yesharim. You start with Torah. Torah brings you to vigilance, which brings you to alacrity, which brings you to cleanliness, which eventually brings you all the way to the highest levels of greatness, fear of sin, and holiness. And it's really interesting that where do we start? We started with a question: how do you prevent sin at night by not sinning during the day, or not thinking things during the day? And Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was sitting there, and he's trying to figure out how is it possible to prevent the ball from rolling, the beginnings, the germination of sin. And on that, he built what became the whole book of Mesilas Yesharim, this whole process, starting with Torah, and in integrating that into character to cleanse, so to speak, all the hardware, the physiology that causes sin, stop it before it gets started. And therefore, you won't think sinful things by day and won't bring you to a sinful nighttime. Okay, so there's many other laws brought one after another, of course. So, for example, if there's an escaped slave, you can't return him to the owner. There should not be people, boys and girls, designated for sin amongst the Jewish people. Don't take usury interest from your Jewish brethren. You have to pay your debts. If you pledge to give a donation to tzedakah or to the temple, you have to make sure you pay it. Additionally, if you have an employee who's working in the fields, you cannot say that he cannot partake in any of the foods. Then chapter 24 begins with a law of someone who gets married. And it's interesting, we know Jewish marriages happen through a conveyance of money. So for example, a man gives a woman a ring, he says a special formula: behold, you are married to me, behold, you are betrothed to me, gives her the ring, she becomes married. What is the source that marriage transactions happen with monetary value? It's chapter 24, verse 1 of Deuteronomy. When a man shall take a woman. How do we know that? How does that transaction happen? So if you look all the way back in Genesis, when Abraham is buying a burial spot, a grave spot for his wife Sarah, and he buys it from Ephron, it says the word kach with regards to money. And the Talmud says, well, here it says kach with regards to money, and here it says kach with regards to marriage. It must be that these two words, because they're the same word, they're linking these two sections together, and thus, just like the transaction with the grave happened with money, so to the transaction of marriage happens with money. And I think it's a great example of the intricacies of the Torah's written Torah and the oral Torah integration. If I told you, find me in the Torah anywhere where it says that marriage happens with money, in all likelihood, you could look for days on end, you won't find it. But with the oral Torah is like the decryption key. The written Torah, everything is there, it's hidden. Well, how do you find what the message really is? You take the oral Torah and you use that as a prism to try to understand the written Torah, and you could reveal all its secrets. Again, many laws one after another. Let's go through them really quickly here. A man gets married. He's not allowed to go to war, but also he has to be home for an entire year. At the nascent stages of marriage where the couple are getting to know each other, they're acclimating with each other, and there's, of course, many hurdles and obstacles that need to overcome. It's important that they have time with each other. They spend time with each other for at least a year. He doesn't go away on business trips. He doesn't go away at nights. They're together. I would say, perhaps we could say, in today's day and age, people could be together, but everyone's glued to their phone. I would probably surmise the Torah doesn't mean just be together. It means develop and deepen and nourish the relationship so that it could grow and flourish forever in the future. There's a law of a kidnapper. What happens if someone kidnaps, God forbid? Again, we're told not to speak negatively about other people. Lashon hara will get saras. Remember what happened to Miriam. What happens if you lend someone money and you take a collateral? Don't walk into his house to demand the collateral, because that is demeaning for him. Wait outside, let him give it to you. If he's poor, don't take away the collateral that he needs for his daily use. Don't cheat the poor person. Don't cheat the convert, the people that are less fortunate amongst you. Pay someone on the day they're supposed to be paid. Don't let them wait and have to ask you for it. Don't deviate. Don't pervert the judgment of the proselyte, of the convert, or the orphan. Remember that you too were once unfortunate when you were slaves in Egypt. Hashem saved you. Therefore, you have to remember those people as well. When you have a field and there's various leftovers, there's bundles that you left, there's various grapes that you left, you drop something, leave it for the poor, leave it for the hungry, leave it for the convert, leave it for the widow, leave it for the orphan. Chapter 25 talks about some of the judicial procedures and laws. Just a quick note here. There is a famous idea called kimle b'derabamine, which means if someone with one act or if in one time they commit two sins, one sin that warrants them a very severe punishment and one a more relatively minor punishment, we're told here, just an interesting law that appears very frequently in the Talmud, don't mete out both punishments, give him the more severe punishment, which is more inclusive. So if someone, for example, commits an act that gives them capital punishment, and in the same act they also damage someone's property, you only give them the more severe punishment, not the more minor punishment. There's a law of levirate marriage. Two brothers, one of them dies without children. The second brother marries the widow to build a legacy and a namesake for the deceased brothers. I'll just say quickly, this appears in 10 verses in Deuteronomy, or 6 verses of Deuteronomy. I spent many months, even years of my life studying the Talmud book of Yevamos, which talks about levirate marriages and all its details. So, of course, we're skimming through the Torah, just trying to get the whole story of the Parsha and pull some quick lessons. But, of course, the depths of the discussion are endless and profound. The Parsha concludes with a shop owner to not have mismatched stones. So suppose when someone says, I want to buy a pound of potatoes, and you have a stone that equals a pound to weigh it out, it should be no less than a pound. Don't have small stones for selling and big stones for buying. And if someone does that, if someone is dishonest in business, the Parsha ends with remembering Amalek. Amalek is the nation that is most opposite to the Jewish people. If we stand up for truth and for justice and for righteousness and for God, they stand up for everything that's in opposition to that. They are essentially the Torah's version of the Nazis. Evil and pure evil. Says the Torah, when you see these people, you have to remember to destroy them. And I think the lesson is that there's some people and some nations and some elements of society that are beyond repair and must be squashed and must be eradicated. For God to be in the world, for God's glory to be manifest, there cannot be forces that are antithetical to that. Amalek is an idea, it's a nation, but it's also a rallying cry. It is what we as a nation, the Jewish people, are designed to combat and ultimately to dismantle and to destroy.